Uri. Hey, look at that. You speak and it happens. Thank you, Juan. Uri is a dear friend and teacher, mentor. I have known Uri since I was, 16 years old. He is the reason I became a rabbi. He was the inspiration to me. I know. You think it's my father. Don't tell my dad. But Uri opened up the light inside me and love of Judaism and the Jewish people and Israel, and ultimately led to my becoming a rabbi. So great thanks to Uri. He is the best educator in the world. You are all privileged to learn from him. I just wish we could be in Israel. He could guide us in person, physically. God willing, someday we will get to go to Israel, be guided by Uri. This is the second best. We'll have an opportunity to travel in Israel virtually and be blessed with the wisdom that Uri provides. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Uri to take us through this next 3-week trip to Israel virtually. And please reach out if you have any questions, any concerns. Technical questions will go to Juan, eventually Paulette, who will be joining us as well. And anything curricular or otherwise, please email me. I'm back in the office tomorrow after my seminar closes, and I'm happy to be with you all. Thank you. Turning over to Uri.
No, Aria, Rabbi Boxman, before you get off, would you be the one to make me a co-host, or would that be Juan? Who has the?
I can make you co-host. Who am I making co-host?
Uri.
Uri, okay. All right, give me 1 second.
You bet. And before Rabbi Boxman gets off, I will just say that it's just a wonderful pleasure. I feel like I'm coming home. And actually, early on in this pandemic, Rabbi Boxman, Junior and Senior, were the first ones to one of the first to grab me and say, let's do something. Let's do some kind of virtual programming. So I look back at that early PowerPoint and I cringe, but I've come a long way. But it's been a journey. So it's wonderful to see you again. And with no further ado, I will share with you that, yes, my name is Uri Feinberg. I've been living in Israel most of my life. I was born in the States. My parents moved to Israel when I was 10 years old. So I was made aliyad, kind of grabbed by the scruff of my neck. I had somewhat of a normative path, whatever that means, school, high school, the military. I traveled afterwards for an extended period of time to get off the island a little bit, came back, and I've been a Jewish educator for about 25 years now. I started as a summer guide and educator for the nifty teen trips, and then shortly after that began teaching in the EIE program, which is the High School in Israel program that Rabbi Boxman referenced before. Now it's called Heller High. I taught Jewish history, undergrad, master's degree, various things, tour guiding license. I have been both in the field and in the classroom. And we spent about 3 years in Boston about a decade ago. My wife, Meryl, and we have 3 daughters. My wife is from the States. She's from Brooklyn, New York. And we always wanted to have a stronger connection for a period of time. So we spent a few years in the States, which was a wonderful experience, with the notion that we would come back, of course, and this is where we would raise our family. And while we were in Boston, that's where we spent our 3 years, where she has family as well. I served as the interim director of education of a Reform synagogue in Boston. It was a wonderful experience. We came back, and I've been working as a tour educator pretty much since we've returned. The last year and a half, of course, a little bit more than a year and a half now, has sent us all into somewhat of a tailspin. And I took a deep breath in March, when I remember I was told not to go back to my group on March 14th, I think it was. And that was it. And everything came to an end as far as tourism goes. And I took a deep breath and I wrote to a bunch of rabbis that I know, amongst them Rabbi Boxman. I said, how do we partner moving forward? And essentially for the last 19 months, 18 months, whatever it is, I've been doing this. I've done my best to reharness what it is that I do and to be able to connect. And on the one hand, I think it was beneficial for people who have joined me on these journeys, but it's as beneficial for me to be able to continue to, well, not only do what I do, but to stay in touch, and to stay in touch with all the questions that I pose and all the places that I share and all the moments in time that we discover, whether through virtual tours like the one we're about to engage in, or in the history courses that I lead. I ask the questions, but I ask myself the same questions, and it's allowed me to, well, continue to rejuvenate myself, and absolutely pun intended. And what we're going to be doing over the course of the next 3 weeks is we're going to peel back different layers of the state of Israel and the land of Israel. And we will thematically follow various trails. Today, as you know, in the footsteps of the early Zionists. And the following week will be going up to the Golan Heights and pulling back as many layers that the Golan has to offer. And then our third week will be going back 2,000 years to the Second Temple period. But in each of these cases, what we will do our best to do is not only share and to show, but also to try and ask ourselves, how is this relevant to me? Why do I care? We'll get there. Now, how are we going to do this? We're going to do this using Google Earth as our baseline of travel. In a moment, we're going to get on the bus or on the plane, and we're going to fly and land in Israel. If you've never used Google Earth before, it may be somewhat disorienting. So you might want to look away while we fly and zoom in and out. So just be aware of that. And when we land at various sites, there's a 360-degree option to view, and I'll utilize that to show you where we are. But we also have the option for sharing photographs and maps and clips, video clips, short clips, which will include a guide on the ground who will share where we are in some of the stops in some of the cases. Lastly, I will add that towards the end of our trip, we are actually going to meet an Israeli, and we'll do our best on each of these journeys to meet someone, at least in the first two. So it's not just my voice you're hearing. And in this particular case, we're going to go to a kibbutz and meet a kibbutznikit, a woman who's been living on this kibbutz for many, many years. Now, of all the clips that you will encounter over the course of the next 3 days, the clip at the end of our session will be the longest. It'll be about 14 minutes. That's the longest clip. And I spent a half a day with her, and it was the best I could do because I didn't want to eliminate what I felt was key in understanding not only what is a kibbutznikit, but who is she? Who is Lydia? And anyway, we'll get there and so on. Our goal is to stick to 75 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes together. It could very well be, because of this bit of an introduction, we may go over a few minutes. So just keep that in mind. I apologize in advance, but not by much. I mean, we won't go over by much. As far as questions go, because I'll be sharing my screen with Google Earth, and it's a little difficult to check the chat while I'm flying away, you can put the questions in the chat room. And at the end, I'll open it up and we'll see what questions are there, if there are any. Or we're not that big a group. We're about 30 people. What does it look like? 37. Oh, well, we'll see how we do. We're all probably Zoom capable. And if we want, we can just unmic ourselves and ask the questions, but we'll take it as we go. So without further ado, first of all, I hope everyone is feeling good. And it is once again a pleasure to be with you. I'm speaking to you right now from the city of Modi'in, where I live. I mentioned my wife, Meryl, and our 3 daughters. Our youngest daughter, Adi, is 14. She's in 9th grade. My middle daughter, Shira, graduated this past July. And in just 2.5 weeks, will be going into her military service. And my oldest daughter, Meitav, just got out of her 3 years of military service back in August. So a lot of things going on, and I'm happy to travel with you. All right, so I am going to take it away. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Technology is great, but at times there can be glitches. So I know Juan is back there behind the scenes. If there's any issue, then I'll be back, not to be concerned, and we'll take it from there. All right, here we go. And just get rid of this. Oh, this is my family, by the way. And we are off. All right, there we go. So very important that we catch the bus. Of course, we're all traveling to Israel. I know that some of you have been to Israel many times, and some a few times, and some never. And that's okay because, well, we're about to very familiar place. Let's see, where is that turnoff? Oh, there it is. There is Temple Shalom right over there. Although I don't see the bus anywhere. I think the bus might, well, you know what? Why do we don't even have to wait for the bus. Let's just fly away and make our way from Temple Shalom all the way over to Israel. There you go. Very nice. Very nice. Now this might, here, let me just move some of your beautiful faces out of the way there. And I'm going to zoom out for a moment and we can take a look here at the map of Israel. Again, a map that might be very familiar to some of you. And you can see the line here that runs through the edge of the Sinai Desert through the Negev, and then the Jordanian border over here, up to the Golan Heights, and then across the Lebanese border, and of course down the coast. We're looking at a country that's about 20,000 square kilometers. It's not very big. We're looking at about 500 kilometers or so in length, actually a little bit less. So what is that? About 300 plus miles or so in length. And at its widest point, about 130 kilometers. So that would be, I don't know, 80 miles or so. Not very big, not very wide or tall. There's 9.3 million people who live here, of which about 76% are Jewish, about 22% are Arab, and there is also a small percentage of those who are not this or that. Of the Arabs who live here, the vast majority are Muslim. There is a minority that are Christian. And we can, of course, dissect that even more and break down what kind of Muslims, what kind of Christians, and in fact, what kind of Jews live here. Because as we know, there is more than one kind of Jew. If we look at Mizrahi Jews, Jews who hail from Arab countries in North Africa, from Muslim countries, sometimes mistakenly lobbed under the umbrella of Sephardic, but Mizrahi, which means Eastern Jew, and Ashkenazi Jew, we're looking at about a 60-40 split, actually 55 and 45% split, a little bit favoring the Mizrahi Jews as far as numbers. There is much to say about the country itself, which we're not going to do because we do want to get started with our tour. And in order to do that, we're going to zoom on down and land right in the ancient port of Jaffa. Okay, hopefully you have already landed and the screen has stopped moving. Now we can spin around and see where we are. If you've been to Tel Aviv, Jaffa before, you may even recognize where the bus drops us off right over here. And there's restrooms right in here if anybody needs. And if you need to grab yourself a coffee in what was storerooms for the ancient port of Jaffa, now is a little cafe over there. But what we're doing is we're here to really enjoy the view. Now, I mentioned already this idea of in the footsteps of the early Zionists. We have to ask this question: what is a Zionist? Well, a love of the land of Zion, somebody who loves Israel. Very nice. But where does the word Zion come from? Zionism is actually a modern term from the 19th century. Conceptually, however, it is age old. There has always been a yearning to return from the days when we were first exiled in 586 before the Common Era to Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, there we wept for ye Zion. And continuously, even when there were moments where we were allowed to return, we were then exiled again. And for thousands of years, literally thousands of years, we have been yearning to return. Zion is a biblical word. The etymology is either the city of David or the hill and the fortress where the city of David to become the city of Jerusalem lies, or the land of Israel. At different times, mentioned over 150 times in the Bible, it is reflective of this land, Zion. And therefore, we are going to follow the footsteps of the early Zionists, so who in fact were the early Zionists as we stare out into the ancient port here. I keep saying ancient port, but it's actually Jaffa is part of the city of Tel Aviv from 1948, Tel Aviv Jaffa. However, Jaffa predates Tel Aviv by about 5,000 years. So who are these early Zionists that we're referring to? Well, you might recognize this gentleman here with the big beard, Theodore Herzl, who arrives towards the end of the 19th century for his 10-day trip, 11-day trip. He has already put in motion the idea of a Jewish homeland, a place where Jews can find a haven in the First World Zionist Congress, which takes place in 1897. And then a year later, he goes to check it out. He'd never been here before. Those early Zionists, however, even predate Theodore Herzl. We're talking about a period of time of the 1880s when this would have been their view of the ancient city of Jaffa from the ships as they pulled into port. Now, if we had all the time in the world, I would tell you that, well, Zionism is very nice, but we could use Jaffa as a backdrop to go back thousands of years, because Jaffa is an archaeological tell, a tell layer upon layer upon layer of, well, human existence, civilization upon civilization upon civilization. We can go back to the Egyptian period about 3,500 years ago when the Egyptians were here, and they were here after the Canaanites. That we have archaeological ruins and an archaeological dig here on Jaffa, which is the tell. We could go back and speed through our biblical narrative, the Bible, and talk about King Solomon, who the son of King David, who becomes king in the year 960 before the Common Era, who's going to bring the cedars of Lebanon, sail them down the shore, and eventually take them off the ships in Jaffa up to Jerusalem to build the first temple. If I really wanted to spend time talking about Jaffa, I'd speed through the Bible and get to the story of Jonah, who is the prophet who is told by God to go to Nineveh, and well, he doesn't want the job, and he runs to Jaffa, jumps in a boat. Well, eventually he gets you know the story, thrown overboard, and there's a whole Pinocchio story, and eventually fate and God has a different journey for him. But coming back to our friends, the early Zionists, those early Zionists who arrived in the early 1880s. I say the early Zionists because that's going to be the period of time of a movement that will be defined by bookend by 1882 to 1903, known as the first wave of immigration, the first Aliyah. And they are going to be arriving because of a push factor and a pull factor. What's the pull factor? Thousands of years of yearning to return. What is the push factor? The anti-Semitism and the ongoing pogroms in Europe. Except the problem is when they take that deep breath, when they get off of the shore, off of the boat, and all that history, that memory, that collective DNA that we have pulling us to the land, we take a deep breath as we look up at the ancient city and we say, yuck, this is gross. This isn't what we dreamed of. And look how cramped and dirty and dangerous Jaffa is. And when we do that, we realize that perhaps this isn't the city on a hill that Hawthorne will write about, amongst others. And we look to the north and we say, that is where we're going to build our future. So you know what? Before we actually head too far north, why don't we go to a nice overview and take a look at, well, the sand dune upon sand dune upon sand dune. We had just arrived, by the way, I'll just spin around for a moment, just down below over here, just down below beneath this church. Oh, by the way, Jaffa is important not because of its historical, not just because of its historical connection to the Jewish memory and the collective sense of identity that we know of that goes back thousands of years, but for Christianity, it is also a central place. In fact, the Church of St. Peter over here is built on the site of, well, earlier Crusader churches, and even there's Byzantine ruins there. because of the Christian narrative in which, as we know in the book of Acts, after Jesus is going to be crucified and resurrected at the end of the gospel, it will be in the book of Acts that Peter is going to take the mantle and, well, lead. And he is brought to Jaffa to heal a woman by the name of Tabitha, which he does. And it'll be from here that he sets out to Caesarea, and the history of the world will never be the same as we begin to see the first steps in a complete breakaway from what was Judaism into Christianity. But I digress, because when the early Zionists arrive on this hill, obviously looking to the north, they do not see the view that we see right now, which is the city of Tel Aviv, but rather they see these sand dunes. Sand dune over sand dune over sand dune, because that's what was here. This picture, in fact, is even later than the 1880s. This picture is from 1909, and this is where the city of Tel Aviv would be born, right where these folks are standing. They're getting ready to, well, have a very historic photograph and declare the city of Tel Aviv born in the year 1909. Obviously, something has changed here. I will tell you, however, when those early Zionists arrive, fresh in their minds of arrival in 1882, at the beginning of the first Aliyah, the first wave of immigration, will be the words that maybe they even read on the boat ride over. And that is from the book written by Leon, the pamphlet written by Leon Pinsker, Auto-Emancipation. Jews, you will never be welcome anywhere. You will always be a stranger. You need to figure out that, in fact, you deserve freedom and emancipation. But don't expect anyone to give it to you. You need to grab it yourself. Auto-emancipate yourself, Pinsker said. And you can imagine the power of that passage as they look out on the verge of grabbing their own destiny in their ancient land. Now, honestly, we're not here today to talk about the modern city of Tel Aviv, which is the second largest city in Israel at about 420,000, 450,000 residents, a size of about 52 square kilometers, the capital of our culture and our economy. Our Pentagon is also here in Tel Aviv. It is the city that never sleeps. It is the big orange. It is a party town that rivals the partiest towns in Europe. The Pride Parade here would put others to shame. It is, for those Tel Avivis, the essence of what it means to be Israeli. And as you may imagine, there's a challenge for those who come from Jerusalem, for example, who see Jerusalem as the quintessential Jewish city and Tel Aviv nothing more than a city of Jews. Whereas the Tel Avivis will look and be able to visualize the manifestation of the dreams that were worded by those like Theodore Herzl that said, Im tirtzu enzu agada. If you will it, it is not a dream. And here before their eyes, they have the embodiment of what they defined as their vision for the future, the New York of the Middle East, a gateway into this world. But we have to recognize that these early Zionists are going to have to live somewhere. And the very first place they go is the very first Jewish suburb in the world that wasn't a ghetto. And we have now landed in a neighborhood that is called Neve Tzedek. Neve Tzedek, which today, as you can see, is very shishi, very posh, has been gentrified, which has pluses and minuses to it. It is a neighborhood that was built in about 1886, when the first residents moved in, and the idea was to take that concept of looking up at ancient Jaffa and going, yuck, this is gross, and being able to visualize a different reality. So they created a suburb. These are Jews who arrived from Eastern Europe, from Galicia, from Romania, but also Jews who arrived from Yemen, who were coming also during the first wave of immigration, and Jews who had been living in Jaffa from the days of the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and those Jews who never left Jaffa. They all begin to move out and to build the antithesis of what Jaffa was. Give us a sense of what it looks like from above. These red-roofed houses, still part of Jaffa, but it's very different. Now, you can see also the type of architecture is really phenomenal of what we have today. Parts of it have been completely gentrified, and some have actually been left as they were. But the issue is that by the 1980s, the neighborhood had fallen into real decay, and it was decrepit and disarray, and begins the process of that gentrification. What we see, by the way, in any major city, that inner city, the places where you would never step foot, perhaps 40 or 50 years ago, now you can't afford to live there because of all that process. And this, in fact, was the inner city as far as Tel Aviv goes. This is where Tel Aviv was born, even before it was born. In this beautiful square that we're in right now, we see what's known as the Suzanne Dalal Center for Performing Arts and Dance. And it is home, among other things, to Israel's premier dance company, the Bat Sheva Dance Company. So it really is a wonderful spot in Tel Aviv, but more importantly, it tells the story of our first steps out of Jaffa and, well, creating what would be the modern state of Israel. Now, before we leave Tel Aviv, I want to stop and share maybe my favorite ice cream place here in Israel, and specifically in Tel Aviv, and that is Anita Ice Cream over here. There's actually a non-dairy part and the dairy part of Anita Ice Cream. And you can see we're still within Neve Tzedek. The street, by the way, Shabazi Street, Shalom Shabazi, is a 17th century Yemenite spiritual leader who was a profound and prominent poet as well. So how does that fit in? I mentioned the Yemenites who also arrived in the 1880s. While on the one hand, the early days of Zionism was fueled by that, I said the pull factor, but the push factor and what was happening around them in Europe. There were different isms all over the place, the national isms, the need for a shared language and culture and history. So it was that kind of movement. For the Yemenite Jews, however, it was 100% religious. There was almost a messianic fervor amongst Yemenite Jews when they begin to arrive as well in the 1880s. But this perhaps then is the quintessential melting pot of all of those different peoples who arrive. And if we just want to wet the palate a little bit, there is some really serious decadence going on over here with Anita Ice Cream, which started, by the way, in Shuk HaCarmel. Actually, it started from her selling it out of her house, and then her sons and her children selling it in the Carmel market, which is just around the corner, and eventually to the shops all over the country and even internationally. But enough about that. Why don't we head north and make our way to really our first foundation of that first wave of immigration, the first Aliyah. And we have landed right now in the city of Zikron Yakov. Now, if you're not so familiar with Zikron Yakov, fortunately we have a guide here who has a map open for us and we can take a look. You can see where our guide is pointing right over here. We were in the city of Tel Aviv, just right over here, and he's pointing exactly where we are in the city of Zikron. You can see it's a little bit south of the city of Haifa, overlooking the Mediterranean. Now, the coffee here is pretty good. So I thought that maybe what we would do is maybe talk a little bit about the history of Zikron, because it's very much connected to the first wave of immigration. When those first Jews arrived, 1882 to 1903, we're looking at about 25,000 or so who come during this period of time. The first group that arrives is going to be a group that is, you know what, maybe I'll put up the map here so you can take a look at the map while I speak. That first group is going to be a group that's energized by an organization called Bilu. Bilu would be this Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha, the house of Jacob, get up and go, and they would be part of lovers of Zion, Chovevei Zion they were called. And they arrived from, we're looking at Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, that area, of course, the larger Russian Empire, Galicia, Romania, and we mentioned Yemenite Jews as well. Now, the truth is they have no idea what they're doing. The Ottoman Turks are in control, and they're the ones who are selling off the land for the most part. There were also absentee Arab landlords who are selling off land, and most of the time, the Jewish philanthropists in Europe who are purchasing land for the early Zionists who arrive are purchasing the land which is sold sight unseen for the most part, which ends up what we thought was lakefront property to be malaria-infested swampland. Now, there were also the local Arabs who were living in the land of Israel at the time, which was then called Palestine. And most of the local Arabs who are living here are living within the old world empire of the Ottoman Turks, and for the most part, living somewhat of a serfdom within the Ottoman Empire, that they were the serfs, in fact, or the peasants or the farmers, and of course it was the Ottomans who controlled the region. Now, when they arrive, and in this particular case, about 100 new immigrants from Romania arrive on a rocky hillside, and very soon after they arrive in the early 1880s, it seems like the whole endeavor is going to fall apart. But it doesn't fall apart. Why not? Why doesn't the malaria and the challenge and the difficulty put a stop to this endeavor of creating a town or something here that will be different than what had previously been here? Well, this gentleman right here happens, a guy by the name of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. And this gentleman here is of those Jewish philanthropists that I was talking about. You can see he's memorialized here in a stamp a while back. Of course, the water tower of this town of Zikron Yakov, where we are right now. This is him on his last visit in the early 1920s here. This is after the Balfour Declaration, the beginning of the Mandate period. He realizes that the early Zionists here need backing, they need help, they need professionalism, they need salaries, they need vision, and Rothschild, from the French branch of the Rothschild family, is going to create not only clerks that are here able to pay the farmers and to allot them land along a main road, but he's also going to create industry here, a bottling factory and a winery that he's going to carve out of the rock that is Mount Carmel. And essentially will save this young town, which will soon be called Zikron Yakov, named after his father, but we'll get to that in just a moment. And you can see here, this is the Carmel Winery, which is the largest winery that we have here in Israel, about 15 million bottles a year, with their orchards all over the country, their vineyards all over the country. In 1892, there was actually a parasite that almost destroyed everything, this whole winery business. But then Rothschild says not to worry, and he goes ahead and he brings more resilient vines from the United States, and from there they never look back. What we're going to do is take about 5-6 minutes or so, and we're going to experience with a guide on the ground the city of Zikron Yakov. We first start in one of the vineyards, and there's no sound yet in the vineyard, so don't be concerned, and then we will meet our guide.
And then in 1886, Baron Edmund de Rothschild is going to go ahead and commission the building of the synagogue that you see behind me. It's called Ohel Yaakov because it's named in honor of his father, James Rothschild, and James' Hebrew name was Yaakov. Building a synagogue was right up the alley of those first Aliyahers. Because on the one hand, yes, they were motivated to leave, and there was the pull factor. There was also the push factor from the pogroms that were going on in Europe. But when they arrived, they wanted to create something new. Not completely new in the sense that they were leaving the old Judaism behind, because the synagogue came with them, the rabbi came with them, the idea at least. But they were not going to the four holy cities like those Jewish pilgrims over the centuries had done, to Jerusalem, to Tzfat, to Hebron, and to Tiberias. They would create Rishon LeZion, Rosh Pina, and Zikron Yakov. And in 1882, the first pioneers came here and created on this hillside what ultimately would become Zikron Yakov. About a year later, a patron was found, Baron Edmund Rothschild, and he would stand behind what was happening here. Not only would he build this synagogue, which opened up in 1886, a year later, in 1887, would come here and be here for the official dedication.
Now, the city itself is really just a small, quaint town with about 24,000 people who live, as I mentioned, just south, about 35 kilometers south of the city of Haifa. This is the main pedestrian mall with very nice cafes on either side, artists and galleries as well. And in just a moment, we're going to stop and talk briefly about another period of time.
One of the most prominent families were the Aronson family here in Zikron Yakov. Now, the period of time that I want to touch on before we move on along our journey today is actually not about the first Aliyah. It's a little bit later during the First World War. And of this Aronson family, we're actually standing in front of the Aronson home. I want to mention two family members, two of the children of the Aronson family. One is Aaron Aronson. Aaron Aronson, the older brother, was a world-renowned agronomist. Of the things that he did with his life was to discover on his lengthy journeys here in the Holy Land a more resilient wheat. Perhaps the original wheat, the undomesticated, the wild wheat, in Hebrew we called emachita. Now, because of his international notoriety, he really endeared himself upon the British. And not only that, he was given the freedoms to roam freely in this area, came across British officers giving information about the Turks who were here. All information which was going to be priceless for the British, because we know that they're ultimately from the south going to come up in 1917 and oust the Ottoman Turks from here. The second member I want to mention is Sarah. Sarah, Aaron's sister. Now, the two of them, along with several other members, one whose name was Uri Feinberg, would create an espionage unit that would provide in an organized manner information for the British. At a certain point, every 2 weeks, a ship would come offshore the Mediterranean Sea. Here in Zikron, we're only about 35 kilometers south of the city of Haifa, on the slopes of Mount Carmel. And as the crow flies, probably about 7 or 8 kilometers, and you're already on the shores of the Mediterranean. Now, this information back and forth held up until, sadly, one of the communications, which was oftentimes sent via carrier pigeon, was captured by the Ottoman Turks, and they realized something was going on. And this spy organization, which was called Nili, Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishakel, the strength of Israel shall not fail, was pinpointed to be headquartered here in Zikron Yakov, and the British ultimately are going to capture Sarah Aronson. Now, she's tortured for several days. Battered and bloody, they want to take to the headquarters, and she says, wait a second, let me at least change my clothes, let me go back to my home. And she's brought here to her house. She goes into one of the back rooms and opens a slick. A slick was a secret compartment in one of the doorposts of this house, and she takes from there a pistol. She quickly writes a note saying very clearly, we did not give any information. We will not fail. You will prevail. And she throws it out the window, hoping that it will be found one day. She takes the gun and she shoots herself. Very sadly, she doesn't die of her wounds. I say very sadly because she had already been tortured, and the purpose was not to elicit any information. It took her few more days, and then ultimately she'll die of her wounds. The Aronson family is an integral part in the annals of the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and Sarah is as heroic as any of our heroes, especially in that period of time leading up to the formation of the State of Israel.
So, very nice that our guide was very excited to tell you the story. Obviously, it wasn't the British who tortured Sarah Aronson, but rather the Turks. And as I mentioned, the first Aliyah happens earlier, 1882 to 1903, but it will be the Aronson family of the founders of Zikron Yakov who arrived from Romania. What we're going to do now, as we've had a sense at least of these early Zionists, and you might remember that I mentioned, or our guide mentioned, that the first wave of immigration, on the one hand, was going to do things differently, or try to at least, than those pilgrims, Jewish pilgrims who had arrived for centuries and eons, when they would make their way primarily to the four holy cities of Tzfat, Jerusalem, Hebron, and Tiberias, and rather maybe also go there, but also outside those cities to create something new. And this new endeavor would be called a moshava. A moshava, not a moshav, not a kibbutz, but a moshava. And this would be a first attempt at modern existence in the land of Israel. What, however, is the same, perhaps, is they brought with them their rabbi and their synagogue, meaning their connection to Judaism would be similar. I point that out because we'll see that that is going to change. And what we're going to do is fly across the Galilee and make our way right to, well, overlooking the Sea of Galilee, the Kinara itself. And this Sea of Galilee, you can see this is our route all the way down towards the Kinara. We're in the eastern part of the lower Galilee region. We can see the Golan Heights over here. These are the southern reaches of the Golan Heights. We can see the Jordan Valley open up. And if we were to drive along this valley for about an hour and 45 minutes, we would eventually get to the Dead Sea. And we can even make out in the haze the mountains of the Kingdom of Jordan. You can see as the Golan Heights come down, the Jordanian mountains go up. But what I would like to do actually is we're going to have the bus pull over. We're going to carefully step over this barrier, and just right over here amongst these olive trees, I think our guide wants to share a few words with us.
Of all the lands there are of dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of color, they are unpicturesque in shape. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Palestine is desolate and unlovely, and why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? That's a very interesting description as we stand here overlooking the Sea of Galilee and the Golan Heights and the fields down below, because Palestine is desolate and unlovely. You know what? I'm not so sure. So a few things could have happened. Could be that this particular person who is describing what we're seeing wasn't here. Could be that that person didn't exactly know how to describe what they were seeing, or perhaps there's something else. And this particular excerpt is from a book that was collected from a series of articles that were written by a traveler who comes here to what was then called Palestine, to the Holy Land, and writes a travelogue for his newspaper back in the United States. This is back in 1867. His name, Mark Twain. Now, I think we can agree that Mark Twain knew how to put pencil to paper and could describe a thing or two. So what is going on here? Is, in fact, there nothing to look at? Is there nothing picturesque in shape? Is everything dull? What he is describing is what he saw. In fact, there was nothing picturesque. Everything was dull. There wasn't anything distinct. And yet, today, we see something very, very different. In the heart of the orchards that we see down below, the life that can be felt is the blue of the Sea of Galilee, the lowest freshwater lake in the world, which sits itself at the foot of the Golan Heights, which are across the way. This entire landscape tells a story, and it tells a story of the continuing progress of that movement that is known as Zionism. And what we're going to try and discover, who were these people that came at the beginning of the 20th century? How were they connected to the people who came before them? And what did they leave behind Well, we can see some of it from here.
Well, that's very nice. We had definitely a nice view, and it's a nice setup for us as we get back on the bus. We'll follow this minibus down and make our way to, well, I think a great spot where we can actually figure out who are, well, if there was a first wave of immigration, you automatically know there's got to be at least a second one. So who were the second aliyahers? Remember, the word aliyah means to ascend, to immigrate. Who were they, and how, in fact, were they different from the ones who came in the first wave of immigration? So let's just hop on down, just down the hill. And in a moment, we will actually make our way into this what we call a training farm, and we'll hear more about that. But before we do, I want to, well, have a bird's eye view of where we are. And then we'll spend a little bit of time in this particular training farm to figure out who these young people were. Now, the Sea of Galilee, the Kinara, the lowest freshwater lake in the world, is about 21 kilometers long, 16 kilometers wide, about 53 all the way around, and is almost at its fullest that it's been in a decade.
So in 1903, something takes place in Europe that will change the history of the Jewish people forever. It's a pogrom. Pogrom, well, we've seen these organized attacks against Jews. It takes place in a place called Kishinev in Eastern Europe. And this pogrom starts because of something called a blood libel, of course, around Easter. When this happens, it will be a repeat of what we've seen in Europe, well, for the last 100 years, if not for the last 2,000 years of persecution. In this particular case, 49 Jews will be killed at the end of this. This moment will be a turning point. Why? Because we hear about it. We hear about it because a guy by the name of Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is the quintessential Jewish writer of his day, to become the national poet of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, goes to Kishinev in the aftermath of this, and he writes his epic poem in the city of slaughter. Now, not to quote verbatim, but ultimately he writes, "The springtime was upon us, the birds were chirping, the new year was begun, and blood flowed through the streets, and you hid in the corner, and you prayed to your God." But essentially what we hear Bialik saying is, he comes out fingers blaring, "It's your fault. It's our fault. We did this. We brought this on ourselves." And he rattles the foundation on which Jewish life stood. Now, he won't be the first person to talk about changing our place, moving from one place to another, because we all know that first wave of immigration that becomes known as the first aliyah, and yet this would ignite a spark in a younger generation that says, not today. We will not have this happen again today. And they transform themselves. Now, as they do, there's work being done here in the land of Israel, then called Palestine, still controlled by the Ottoman Turks, of course. And this work of the early Zionists, one in particular, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Witkin, sends a letter out to the Jewish youth of Europe to encourage them to come. And this is what he writes in order to get them excited about coming here. "Prepare yourselves to fight nature, to struggle with disease and hunger, to struggle with people, friends, enemies, brothers, strangers, Zionists and anti-Zionist. Prepare yourselves for the hatred and cruelty of the environment, where you will be regarded as a dangerous competitor. Be prepared for mockery and denigration. Prepare yourselves for confrontation with all-consuming despair and for baseless arguments which can nevertheless be laid to rest only by struggle and achievement. Hurry up, soon it will all be lost." Now, I never studied marketing before, but I gotta tell you, if I were to invite people to come to Israel today and tell them, "Yes, join me as I guide you around," it's gonna suck. You're gonna hate it. You know what? You might not even make it home alive. I don't know how many people are coming. So what is he talking about? What is Joseph Witkin writing? He's saying, I want you to know it's not easy. You will need to sacrifice. And he actually gets a response. Actually, not directly to him, but in response to a similar letter sent out by Menachem Usishkin, there will be a response of the Jewish youth of Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is what one president of his local chapter of his youth group from Poland writes, "Dear Sir, we are a group of young men and bachelors and students who wish to immigrate to Eretz Israel. We know of the moral corruption devastating the settlers of the land. We know of the baseness of those who should be settling, a noble example for all the diaspora. And we therefore see a great, if not the greatest need to create a fresh national foundation in the land of our forefathers upon which to build the great national structure of national revival. We are well aware of the enormous obstacles that we will find in our path. We are ready to work, suffer, endure in silence for the ideal that is the content of our lives, and to do this in the only land where we can find the solution to all of our ill and bitter problems. And now we ask you, dear brother, is our desire acceptable for the general progress of our movement's work? And is it possible in the present political and economic conditions of life in Palestine? With the blessings of Zion and in the name of all of my friends, yours respectfully, David Green." This David will later change his name to David Ben-Gurion, and David Ben-Gurion, who becomes the first prime minister of the state of Israel, among many other things. What is he essentially saying? Bring it on. So what this ignites is essentially a movement, and it's a continuation of a movement. This wave of Zionism, to be known as the second Aliyah, or the second wave of immigration, is going to create a generation of young people who are going to be 16 and 17 and 18 and 19 years old. And I'm sure there's people out there who can remember what it's like to be those ages. And maybe you remember that, well, you saw the world as clear as could be, and you were going to change the world. Well, so were they. And they come here and they leave their families behind. And, well, they really don't know what they're doing when they're coming from Russia and they're coming from Eastern Europe. And they have to teach themselves how to be farmers. And what we see here at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1908, by the way, is when this photo is taken, there is going to be a training farm which is created. And this is to be known as Chatzar Kineret, or the Kineret Courtyard, or the Kineret Training Farm. And you can see that it's situated right on the backdrop of one of the early moshavot, or those settlements from the first wave of immigration. And clearly, as you can see, there isn't a lot of vegetation. Remember, we saw and heard from Mark Twain. He described what was going on 50 years earlier. Clearly, there was a transformation. Now, where we are now is that training farm, and this is where we transformed ourselves. Was it always perfect? It wasn't. Were there mistakes that were made? They were. This notion of everyone together, the men and the women. By the way, in the early days of the second Aliyah, it was mostly men, but there were women, and there were challenges to equality. And yet, without this movement, there would have been no transformation.
So this is where they came, and it was, in fact, a very difficult reality. In a moment, we're going to cross the street. We'll leave this space and go down, and right on the banks, the shore of the Sea of Galilee, we're going to encounter what's called the Kinara Cemetery. And interesting enough, through a cemetery, we will learn about the lives of who these young people were and, well, where they came from, but more importantly, what was their vision. So if you join me, we'll just carefully cross over and make our way. I guess that's not a good statement to make when you're going to a cemetery that we're going to cross over, but I digress. We're going to spend a few minutes here, so just watch for your guide. I think he might be coming down the path over here.
So we've entered into Kinara Cemetery, and while it continues to serve the population of Kibbutz Kfutzat Kineret, and actually others who are associated even second degree or third degree removed, it is a place that represents more than just ongoing life and death. It represents the early days of Zionism. It represents the who's who in the early days of Zionism, and it is a monument of sorts to understand who these people were. This generation that moved and was moved from the old country physically to this land, which is an even older country, and yet they were going to create something new, didn't do it in a vacuum. As I mentioned, there were pogroms and there were demands made on themselves to create a new reality for Jews. Mom and Dad, I love you very much, but you're wrong. We're right. We know how to transform ourselves. And they came here to work the land. They saw themselves different than the first Aliyah, that first wave of immigrants who came in the 1880s and the 1890s, who brought with them the synagogue and brought with them the rabbi, trying to create something new, but holding on to the past. They said, no, we don't need that rabbi. We don't need that synagogue. We will transform our Judaism. And they did it by working the land of Israel, by speaking Hebrew as a vernacular, by guarding the land. And these teenagers, and they were teenagers, were also inspired by people who were a little bit older. One in particular was a guy by the name of Aleph Dalet Gordon, an aged 48-year-old, if we can imagine that as being old. He too will be transformed by the passion of these young people, but they will see him as, well, their spiritual father. And in fact, he was the spiritual father of what will be known as the religion of labor Zionism. Now, a young woman by the name of Shoshana Blaustein, who happens to be buried right here, this is what she said of Gordon. Gordon was like a fountain of living water for us, of a fountain of truth. All the problems to which this fruitful period gave birth would be brought up for discussion in Gordon's little room by the light of the small lamp. But how great was the inner light that illuminated the faces and hearts. That's very nice. And Gordon, in fact, was a figure that would transform this generation. But it wasn't always perfect. There were also real challenges. Another young woman by the name of Hannah Meisel tells her story, and she says, among the many mistakes that were made in the new yeshuv, the new settlement, is the fact that it hasn't appreciated the importance of women's labor. While there are many who understood the need for Jewish workers in Palestine, everyone has ignored the vital importance of Jewish women workers. Only a very few succeed in carving out a workplace for themselves. This was a challenging place. So much so, in fact, there were those young people who came with all the passion in the world and, well, ultimately didn't survive. Not because they died of malaria, because they took their own life. Because with all the other pressures of being away from their family, away from their parents, well, we know social settings can be troubling and not everyone fits in. And there was a real challenge here. Now, this woman, Hannah Meisel, actually meets, well, the sister of Shoshana Blaustein, a young woman by the name of Rachel. Rachel, who's born in Russia, is going to arrive in the land of Israel at the beginning of the 20th century as part of this wave of second Aliyah, but she's not coming as an immigrant. She's coming as a tourist. She's coming to check it out on her way to Europe to study, to go to university. And she finds herself working in a kindergarten, end up going up north, up at the Kinara training farm. That inequality that we hear about, well, it was felt so much that the women finally said to the men who were there, that's the way it's going to be. This idealism that we spoke about in the old country isn't playing forth here. We're out of here. And they went up the road and created a training farm just for women. So why am I sitting here in the hot sun on a bench? Because I'm sitting in front of Rachel's grave. Rachel herself was, well, she was a pillar, not just of a period of time. She was a pillar in the annals of the story of the Jewish people. If you walk down the streets in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and you ask someone, tell me, what is your favorite poem by Rachel? Rachel. That's all is needed to know who this poet laureate of the Jewish people in the land of Israel is. Now, her life, well, as you can imagine, was challenging. She comes as part of that training farm, will be part of the group that creates the first kibbutz, 1909, 1910, Kibbutz Degania, just up the road, just on the southern shores of the Sea of Galilee. And she, because of her intellect, will be decided by the kibbutz to send her to Europe to study agronomy. She gets stuck there during World War I, can't come back, returns home to Russia, ends up working with Jewish refugee children, and eventually in 1919, with the third wave of immigration, returns. When she returns to her kibbutz, she has already contracted tuberculosis. The kibbutz makes a decision. There's already children there. You can't stay here any longer. And she leaves. Ultimately, after traveling through various hospitals, she will end up in Tel Aviv, where she dies in 1931. In addition to being that pioneer with her hands in the dirt, transforming with her own hands the reality around her, she writes. And she writes her poetry. And in fact, you could come here and you could see families sitting on the bench that I'm sitting on right now, or perhaps two lovers coming, or perhaps just an individual who wants to sit in the shade. And they'll come here and sit by Rachel, and they'll lift this box, this lid. And what they'll do is they'll take out a book, and there's several actually here, several books of Rachel's poetry. And they'll sit through here and they'll find their favorite Rachel poem. And they'll read it, and they'll read it to be inspired. This cemetery is not really a cemetery where you come to be saddened. It's a cemetery to come and to be inspired.
So this second aliyah is one of inspiration. There is no question. Now, it's important, however, that we realize that we're not talking about a fairy tale land where at the end of every day of work, everyone just gathered around and danced the hora over the bonfire and then went to work the next day. There was real challenge. And this challenge when you're a teenager, we know social settings can be very difficult for anyone for that matter, but especially at those ages, especially when you're alone. So there was real pain, but there was real, a certain humility as well of being able to overcome for the greater picture. And I think that's very important. That, by the way, this kibbutz that we heard about, kibbutz Degania, 1909, 1910, the kibbutz was going to be different than the moshava, which means township. The kibbutz was the collective. Work as much as you can, receive as much as you need. Now, the kibbutz today is very different than the kibbutz that was. But you know what? We actually have an opportunity to talk to a woman who is a kibbutznikit who lives on one of the few kibbutzim that still is that traditional kibbutz. But you know what? Why don't we fly away for a moment from the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the Kineret, and we can hover briefly, just for a moment, over Moshav Nahalal. If I zoom out for a second, you can see where we are. We're about halfway between the Kineret over here and the coast. Moshav Nahalal in the Jezreel Valley area, right on the cusp of the lower Galilee, is the first Moshav. The Moshav, if the kibbutz was the baby of the second Aliyah, the third Aliyah, which begins in the aftermath of World War I, will say, yes, we also want a communal area to live amongst ourselves, but not as communal as the kibbutz. The moshav, therefore, we'd have our private land, but the center of the settlement would be that communal area where we would share collectively. What we're going to do, however, is if we just zoom out for a moment, you can see this area. This is where the Carmel is, where we were near Zikron, and just on the eastern flanks of the Carmel in the valley over here is a kibbutz where we're going to make our way now. We're going to land just above it. We're going to hover just above, and we're going to do our best to now not only hear the facts and the figures, but for about 15 minutes or so, so as I mentioned, we're going to go 5-10 minutes over today, hopefully be able to walk away with a hand on the pulse of at least one person who is an Israeli.
So here we are, Kibbutz Mishmar Emek. We've seen a lot today, gone to several places. We're here to see and feel what a kibbutz is. Now, we're very fortunate because we have the opportunity to meet a very interesting woman. She also happens to be a wonderful woman. Her name is Lydia Eisenberg. And there's so much to tell. I'm going to let her tell. Oh, and here she is right now. Hi, Lydia. Where exactly are we right now?
Well, actually, this is the main entrance to the kibbutz. And one can say, basically, if you'd come around 100 years ago, 99 years to be precise, then you would have seen here tents. A couple of years later, you would have seen some wooden huts, and that would have been the beginning of Kibbutz Mishmaim. So today, what is actually, and we still call it the entrance and the exit, and it's known in Hebrew inside the kibbutz as Merkaz HaKibbutz, the center of the kibbutz. In actual fact, that's not true anymore, because because the center of the kibbutz is way from where we're standing at the moment. The kibbutz has expanded greatly, and today we're a community of well over 600 members and living here with all our children and so on and so forth, probably 1,300 souls. And so I welcome you to my home. Follow me, as they say. This building was an Emda, a guard post in 1948 during the attack on Mishmaemek, which is a very famous attack. Kauji and the troops of Kauji, an army up in the hills very close by. 4 Arab villages around Mishmaemek. And where we're basically standing at the moment, this would have been the kibbutz perimeter. And if you were to swing around with your camera, you can see the beginnings of the kibbutz as it's developing today. I think it's a very good point to start, where we can see the kibbutz of old and the history, and this kibbutz is very, very rich in its history. But where we're going today, and you can see that could be anywhere. It could be Tel Aviv, it could be Herzliya, it could be Haifa, but it is kibbutz Mishmaemek. And if you had come a year and a half, 2 years ago, you would have seen 300 plus cows being milked in the dairy that was on that site. Where are the cows today? Well, they're still our cows, but they've moved across the valley, the Jezreel Valley, to Kibbutz Gazit and joined the herd milking cows there. This is an expanding community, and that's a success story, that the youth of Mishmaemek, after finishing army and coming back to work for a year in the kibbutz, then go traveling. They do their own thing. And they can go out and about wherever they wish. They wish to study with the kibbutz financially supporting them. They have to be back by the age of 28, 29, registered for those studies. And they begin to be accepted into the community, having already seen that they want their future to be here. So I would say we're well over 70%, if not more, of our youth return. Mordechai Bentov, Yaakov Chazan, founder members, the real McCoy. These were the Zionists. These were the guys who came and they turned the soil and they dried the valley that was swamp, and begin a history that we're all so proud of. And I don't want to start crying, but I really do feel that this is an amazing place.
Yes, what is this space over here?
Decided there needed to be something in-house that we could share with our children that would give them a sense of the history of Mishmaemek, not just through a book or oral, but that they could actually physically stand in a building where people had been guarding with their knives, and how they fought tooth and nail not to lose what they'd already built up. And could already see that once they could get through that war, there would be a future, because they were damn sure they were going to make it a success. To show and to share something of that very important history that we are very proud of, even with all the holes, okay? There are parts that are a little bit more sensitive to deal with than others, but this signifies the struggle and possibly the success of being able to survive and to become the thriving community in the state of Israel that we are today. I think, certainly in today, I would want to mention that women were equal to men. I mean, just look at these photographs, and the lady in this photograph, if I'm not mistaken, she became a Chavarat Knesset, a member of the Knesset at a later stage also for Mapam. They trained and they guarded, and some of those girls were only 16, 17, that had guns that were almost taller than they themselves. And they were very much part of Agana al Bayit, of struggling to defend their home. And I am the mother of 5. Today I'm also the grandmother of 12. But my 5 children grew up in children's house. When my first son was born, we lived in one room, and we shared a bathroom and toilet with 2 or 3 other couples. We had no air conditioning, we didn't have a fan even, certainly no refrigerator. And the baby house had everything. They had a refrigerator big enough to put 5 babies in. That son will be actually 50 years of age next year, but came back from the hospital in Afula, and he went into the baby house. But it sounds awful, and there's not enough time here to explain that system. But again, be fair and take into consideration the conditions that we were living in at the time. And I will grant that there were obviously problems, But I have to also say, and this is maybe my British humour kicking in, that many of the problematic children that we had were actually the children of problematic parents, not children of a problematic system. Sure. I'm very happy to say my 5 children, damn good people. As human beings, they have the values that they were educated to uphold and respect. And so I don't see that that system was so terrible. I do, however, say that it had to change at the time that it changed. And we have a pretty long lifespan here. In actual fact, I came to Mishmaemek initially in the mid-60s because we had a relative here who was originally from Czechoslovakia, and she died only in recent years at the age of 103. And she's buried in the Kibbutz Cemetery. As I said, for the older population, it's such a comforting thing to know that you will never be alone, forgotten, and have your dignity stripped. This again is, I sound terribly Zionist, don't I? But, look what was done to come, to drain swamps, to plant the forests, and then to be able to stand here and look at the results of all of that labor, 3 generations. Now we're on our 4th generation. This is my little abode, my own little private corner in the kibbutz. I can actually sit here and drink my coffee and look right across the valley to Nazareth. And there we go. This actually is probably 30 or more years old. The original place would have just been this room, bedroom, and a bathroom and shower here. And I had been offered a number of times new houses, and it just didn't feel right. I felt like this was suburbia and not kibbutz that was being built. Very nice, but not for me. This overgrown hippie from the 60s has to still be able to cling somewhere along the line to the messages of. And I saw the potential here. And the kibbutz added on an extra room for me. And that is my work station and my library. I have a rather extensive library in there. And I love it.
That the kibbutz, as we knew it, has been changing since the late 70s, early 80s, and perhaps has always been changing at various points. This kibbutz is still what we would call a traditional kibbutz in that sense.
Sure.
How many kibbutzim like this are there, and what makes Mishmar Emek so successful? You would think perhaps the other way. If it was privatized, it would be successful, but that's not the case.
Okay. I believe there's somewhere in the region of 273 kibbutzim. The vast majority have privatized, certainly over the last 20, 25 years. Mishmar Emek is a kibbutz that is not privatized. In other words, has maintained the basic messages of everybody is equal, everybody gets the same. I wish people would accept that they also have to work and put in as much there equally, but that's the basic problem of socialism and why it didn't work for so many places. So as we move forward and modernize, there's all the time the struggle to maintain its history, and all our salaries come directly to the kibbutz pot. Individual members all receive exactly the same immaterial of what work they're doing or what they bring in or what they generate by being within the community. Mishmar Emek has gone from being, of course, like most kibbutzim until X years ago, reliant on its agriculture and other smaller industries. We have a massive industry, it's called Tama, but we are connected closely to agriculture because it's farming solutions. And the over-the-edge wrap, the round bales of hay we see throughout Europe and the States and South America today, the cotton, an invention of Tama Industries, which is kibbutz Mishmar Emek. And here I can be cynical. And because I'm saying it, not people that are very critical of Mishmar Emek, that basically, and it's a horrible sentence, but in many ways it's true, that the kibbutz today has sufficient money to remain a socialist kibbutz. So I think this is the most Zionist bear I could possibly introduce you to. I made Aliyah with £3 to my name, a few pairs of underwear, 3 pairs of Levi jeans, and a teddy bear. And we're still together, aren't we, mates? The agricultural community, Moshav, kibbutz, will have such a a construction.
So this tower was built in 1929 and was initially how the kibbutz watered itself.
She's one of the 12. I wish. Hello, little man. I actually haven't spoken about this rather special place in Mishmaemek for 3 months since Corona. It is an exceptionally interesting story within a story within a story. We can see a mother desperately trying to protect a child, and we can see people lining up and going to their fate, one trying to protect the others. And here in the corner, tucked away, hiding in a small place, as so many thousands and thousands of children in particular did during the Holocaust. Which for me, I'm not quite sure which of the two is the most powerful. The mother struggling to protect the child, knowing full well that there's no chance they're going to survive. Or this tiny figure crouching in a small place, possibly knowing that that will be for months, for years, but with the smallest of chances of survival. As the mother of 5, every time I come here, especially when I'm with young people, I have to decide, how am I going to explain it in such a way they won't forget? And possibly kickstart more of an interest in learning about the Holocaust and what led up to the Holocaust, and to deal, certainly on campuses today, with the virulent anti-Israel and anti-Semitism and the rewriting of history, unfortunately. And here I possibly would also mention that my 4 sons all served in commando units in the Israeli army, and my eldest son is actually an invalid from that time, and he was in a coma for 3 months in intensive care in Rambam. And the few times that I was able to come home for a break, this is where I came to sit. I feel I have an ongoing relationship with this mother struggling to protect a child. And I feel, as the years go by, more and more I understand that I would do anything to protect my kids. I started being a peace worker in Givat Chaviva because I wanted a different reality for my children, that hoped they wouldn't serve in an army, that there wouldn't be wars. And I continued because I just don't want my grandchildren to have to go through what my children have gone through. He gave the lady extraordinarily long arms, and he connected it to a message that came out of the Warsaw Ghetto, which we can see inscribed here on the wall. And this was a message that was got out from the Warsaw Ghetto by a lady called Tusia Altman, who was a member of Hashemet, and she realized she was not going to survive, and sent out a message more or less saying her arms were not long enough to reach. And that's why I so identify with this lady up here, because my family is growing, and I'm such a short ass. My arms are staying the same. But there's another point here too, and these are all bullet holes. And apparently, sometime after 1948, members of the kibbutz asked the sculptor, would you like us to repair? And I've been given different versions of the same basic story. When you feel that the Jewish people are no longer in danger, then repair it. And it's not come back for discussion.
Clearly today, the kibbutzim look and feel very different. This kibbutz still feels very much like it used to. If anything, you felt the soul of Lydia, and that is the soul of that chalutza, that pioneer.
So before we depart, and actually we're going to have a quick stop on our last stop, I will say that Lydia, I think, is the embodiment of the multiple layers that the land of Israel itself provides. We spoke about an archaeological tell, layer upon layer upon layer. And Lydia herself, who transplanted herself as a young woman, has spent most of her adult life here on this kibbutz in this valley. She shared that her children were in commando units, and one was gravely injured in a coma even. I won't use the word "and" here. I will put a comma and say, she is and has also dedicated her life to working in creating dialogue between Jews and Arabs, between Israelis and Palestinians. There isn't a contradiction there. In fact, both are fronts in which she understands will help defend her children and her country. And I think there's real power there. But I do want to end with one last stop. And because we're in Zoom, we can fly across the country and land in the capital of the state of Israel, in Jerusalem, right on top of Mount Herzl. If you remember, when we began our journey today, about 80 minutes ago, we started in Jaffa and we encountered a Theodore Herzl who was just barely 40 years old, not even, who was coming on his first trip to Israel to scope out what he had already envisioned. He'll die in 1904 and eventually will be reburied here on what will be called Mount Herzl. This is his grave. In 1902, Theodore Herzl will write a novel, and the novel is called Alt Neuland. If you have a little bit of German, maybe Yiddish, you know that it means old new land. By the way, I'll put in parentheses, that old new land was later going to be the name given to the brand new city born in 1909, just north of Jaffa, Tel Aviv. Tel, an archaeological tell, something very, very old, and Aviv, which means springtime, something brand new. It was a way of paying homage to the visionary and the founder of political Zionism, Theodore Herzl, who dies at the age of 44. But this novel that he writes in 1902 will envision travelers coming to a Jewish state 20 years down the road. And I won't get into what he describes and envisions a utopia of sorts, even though it has problems and mistakes and challenges that are very realistic. He begins, and this is the book you can see in the window there, hopefully, Old New Land. The very first words that you read, even before the introduction, if you will it, it is not a dream. Im tirtzu enzo agada, he writes, and at the very end, in the epilogue, he begins the epilogue by writing, but if you do not wish it, all this that I have related to you is and will remain a dream. Folks, our journey today, the peeling back of those layers of the early days of Zionism, you know what? I think personally very interesting. But it loses its perhaps most prominent layer if we neglect to ask ourselves the question, what am I doing here and why do I care? What in fact is my connection? Can I even relate to these young people who left everything behind to transform their lives and the lives of, well, the Jewish people? Can I consider that, in fact, we're not talking about a fairy tale land, but there were real issues and real mistakes? In fact, the state of Israel is chock full of mistakes that we've made. And it's absolutely okay to be critical of the state of Israel. You just have to get in line behind Israelis. We do it better than anyone else. But if we are going to be comfortable enough to be critical or to point out the challenging parts, we hopefully will be comfortable enough to be able to embrace all of the incredible things that we've been able to achieve and how proud we are of what we have achieved. And we stand on the shoulders of giants, whether it's those early Zionists who we spoke of or all those who came before. We are part of the journey. And if you ask yourselves those questions, what am I doing here and why do I care? You, in fact, are also part of this journey. So, folks, thank you very much. We did go over a little bit. I apologize for that, but hopefully it was worthwhile. I wanted us to really get a sense of who Lydia was. And are there any questions? I think we're still about 35 people in the room. So you can either, if people have to go, of course, no hard feelings. I apologize for going 10 minutes over, but I'm happy to stick around if anybody would like for a few minutes. If you have any comments or questions, I'd be happy to engage. So you can either put in the chat or unmute yourself, and hopefully we won't step on each other's toes. There doesn't have to be questions, by the way. That's okay. And what I will tell you is that I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. So if during the week the questions arise, because there was a lot of information thrown your way, and you would like to ask anything, I will put my email in the chat right now, so that if you would, and of course Rabbi Boxman has it, so if you need to, you can get it from her as well. There you go. And so happy to continue the conversation, and if not, I hope you have a wonderful week. Juan, I don't know if you're still there, but thank you for being in the corners and making sure everything flowed as it should. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful Shabbat. And we will see you all next week. Make sure for our journey to the Golan Heights that you bring your bathing suit, because we're going to need it.
Thank you very much.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Be well. Be safe.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And we have people from Canada and people from Florida, all over the
A great presentation.
toda raba. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Be well. See you next week.